This was a stranger rape, aggravated burglary. These were elderly women in their 80s. Imagine at any age that happening, but being someone from that generation and that period of time, and then found themselves being woken by someone that wanted to force themselves on them.
Operation Minstead was by far the biggest serial rape investigation to date that the Metropolitan Police has ever conducted. He is responsible for a terror campaign. He caused immense pain and suffering to victims and to their families. Nobody expects this type of behaviour. It's unheard of.
Apart from having a very tough case, you've got victims on one side, you've got perpetrators on the other side, you've got witnesses that are either reluctant, unhelpful, or scared.
There was always the possibility that he would get away with this. That, for me, would have been the most frustrating outcome ever. I wanted to see that individual, I wanted to know who he was, I wanted to be able to tell victims who he was, and I wanted to see him have his day in court.
We were determined to do our best. Sadly, it went on for many years.
The investigation took 10 years of my career. It was a constant thought, a constant blight, and a constant pressure. It needed to be solved. A case I will never forget.
In 2001, the Metropolitan Police had a series of linked unsolved sexual offences and burglaries against the elderly community in South East London. The offences had all occurred between 1992 and 1999. The perpetrator hadn't offended for 2 years, but police were convinced he'd strike again.
When I took over in 2001, he hadn't offended for some years. It was frustrating, to say the least. There was lots of challenging aspects of this investigation. The reason that it had been going on for so many years was partly due to the offending pattern.
He worked at night. He stole very little. The police at the time knew they were looking for someone that had broken into a house, targeted an elderly person rather than opportunity. A lot of planning went into it, and raped her. Unusual.
Determined to catch the perpetrator, Simon Morgan and his team re-examined the evidence in each case between 1992 and 1999.
What I inherited was somewhat of a monster, and I would refer to it as a skyscraper built on sand. Prior to me taking over the investigation, the evidence consisted of 9 linked offences. They included 3 rapes, an attempted rape, indecent assaults, and all 9 were the subject of burglaries. So there was already some linkage in the investigation, very important linkage. One of the driving factors for me is that I had an elderly relative that lived close to a catchment area of where he was known to be offending. That gave me all the motivation that I already had, really, but gave me that little bit extra.
The worst of the cases Simon inherited was a double rape that had occurred in 1999.
We're in Orpington, we're in suburbia, and the police get called in the early hours, so about 4 a.m. It would have been Orpington police officers, uniform officers, that came out to quite a distressing call from an elderly female.
I'm afraid I'm raped, I'm bleeding badly. Can you please get some help for me?
That is the 5th of August 1999. I won't say her name, but she suffered a horrendous attack, the most violent out of all of his attacks. They're all bad, but that was by far an unnecessary level of violence.
He had broken into that woman's home late at night. There'd been a design fault in windows, double-glazed windows at that period. It's been put right now, but basically it was clipped in from the outside. Removed the window completely, so there was no broken glass, there was no neighbours hearing anything. The fact that it's a rape, it's an elderly victim, which is quite distressing for young officers coming out to. When they got into the scene, they saw that the victim had lost a lot of blood. And because of her age and the possibility that this could become fatality, they contacted the major investigation team.
He did remove the light bulb from above her bed, and he removed the panic alarm button that she wore on a necklace around her neck. He took her to the sofa in the living room where he attacked her twice. She was brutally raped, her bowels were perforated, and she ultimately spent 6 hours on an operating table to address her injuries.
This type of attack shows that the offender is highly violent and almost sadistic. The level of brutality to rape not just a woman, but an elderly woman who's vulnerable, that shows a level of depravity that we don't see very often.
In 2001, Simon began his investigation by re-interviewing the victims, starting with the woman attacked in 1999.
I visited that lady many a time, and she was desperate to know who he was, why he did it. She wanted to know what progress we were making, and I think quite profoundly she said one day, he not only caused all this damage to me, and she was on lots of medication, but she said, look what he stole. I had a beautiful bungalow, all my family memories, a beautiful garden, and she was living in a tiny flat and barely able to shuffle around. And on a later visit, she said, you must hurry up because the doctor told me today my heart's slowing down. And 2 weeks later, I went to her funeral. Through all the victims that I met, they all remained with me. Once you'd met these victims, you couldn't not do everything possible to find that individual. You had to do all that was lawfully capable. This individual was still out, he was still free, he was still potentially out at night and offending and putting through other poor, innocent victims through the same traumatic experience.
It was after this rape in 1999 that the Met Police realised this offender had struck before.
I was a Detective Chief Inspector, Staff Officer at Scotland Yard. I then moved on through the ranks until 1999 when I became the Detective Chief Superintendent for South East London. I had two deputies, two superintendents. One of them came to me and said, we've had a case come in where a rape had occurred in 1998, and he was overseeing that case because it had been linked to a rape in 1992.
The first known attack took place in October 1992 in Shirley, Croydon.
She was 89 years of age in her home in Shirley. Someone had broken in and raped her. They took the victim to an examination suite, and a divisional surgeon would have been called to go through the intimate swabs that had to be taken.
They'd had a report that this elderly woman had been raped. So very much the corroboration of that offence was required. One very simple principle in forensic science is that every offender will leave something at the scene.
DNA was found, but there was no national database, so it would have been compared against other swabs that were held locally at that laboratory. And if anything had been found, it would have pinpointed who that DNA belonged to. It wasn't.
I would read the victim's statement, and then I would, at the beginning, to go and meet the victims. And it's hard to equate what you read on paper with the person that you actually meet and to understand what they've actually been through. It's an elderly person that should never suffer such trauma when they are so vulnerable at an elderly age.
The next rape case reported to police occurred in 1998, again an attack on an elderly woman.
In the 1998 case, when police attended the scene, they noticed that there was a nightdress in a bowl of water in the sink. That water was carefully decanted, the nightdress taken separately. When the water was analysed, semen was detected in the water, which went on for DNA profiling, and semen was still remaining on the nightdress. It didn't match any named individuals, but it did match the 1992, thereby indicating that the same offender had almost certainly committed both offences.
So the rapes in 1992, 1998 and 1999 are all linked to the same individual, a serial rapist, because the DNA matches from each crime scene.
Because of the 3 offences and the methodology, when we did look back, we found a number of burglaries where no sexual assault or rape took place, where the method was exactly the same.
You're asleep at night alone in your house, and this individual has sat in your garden, he's watched you move from room to room, he can remove the window in one piece. He would target the electric box, he would turn the fuses off, he would pull fuses out. He would go around the house in absolute silence and he would unscrew light bulbs. He'd then approach you, and bearing in mind you're in your 80s, your sight may be failing, your hearing may not be as good as it used to be. And he would shine a torch in your eyes to blind you. We had the briefest of descriptions. That they recognised he was obviously a male. They described his clothing, the balaclava, the gloves.
If you look at this individual standing in your bedroom at the early hours, you're not going to be able to describe him very well.
Well, you can't see anything. Eyes and a head-to-toe cover.
As each new investigation was taken on, and in this case, a serial rapist investigation, it had to be called something. It had to be given an operation name. So it was named Operation Minstead.
Fortunately, there's been very few cases of serial rapists in the UK. But obviously, you think that if someone's prepared to rape once, they're prepared to rape again.
In 2001, the serial rapist in South London hadn't attacked since 1999, but the Met Police were now investigating burglaries that they believed had been carried out by the same man.
You don't need to be a profiler to know that he's a burglar.
Yeah, absolutely.
He knew how to take these windows out. He could remove that whole leaded light window as well. He came gloved up.
Yeah.
He came masked up, so he thought he was going to be seen. Well, we know that he was lying in wait in the garden, watching them go to bed, turning lights off from room to room, not closing their windows.
Yeah.
And he knew that he was going to confront them. And the team called in a profiler, and he came up with a label of gerontophile. Gerontophile comes from geriatrics, and someone who gets sexual pleasure from elderly people.
I think this is probably one of the most difficult types of crimes to deal with, and the police officers involved must have been horrified. Anybody working on that would have been affected by it.
These were not cases of someone saying she consented. This was obvious they didn't consent. And he knew what he was doing. He just wanted to rape them. Imagine at any age that happening, but being someone from that generation and that period of time that had lived through the war, that had lived through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then found themselves being woken by someone that wanted to force themselves on them.
All the motivation I needed was to progress this inquiry, to find this individual, a very dangerous man that needed to be found and needed to be locked up.
One of the past cases linked to the offender was a robbery that occurred 3 months before the violent rape of 1999.
In May of '99, there was a burglary in the Bromley area. A car registration number was recorded, and a witness came forward and reported to police that an individual had been seen getting out of that vehicle, pulling on a balaclava, wearing gloves and walking in the general direction of where the burglary then occurred.
That came into the system. It went through the process of identifying who the registered keeper of that vehicle was. 2 officers went to an address, knocked on the door, and a middle-aged female answered the door. They said, "We're here about a car and a series of offences. Is Delroy Grant in?" She responded by saying, "He's not in, he's not here today," and she went on to describe him as a 21-year-old, which was well below the age profile we had from victims in the description of the rapist, the perpetrator. Having then made a few more inquiries, and it had shown that he had a DNA record, which was not the same DNA profile as that of the person that had raped in 92, 98 and 99. Because the profile that was on the database wasn't the same as the perpetrator of the rapes, it was signed off.
At that time, the police involved were not aware that there was a serial rapist on the loose, and no further action was taken.
I think we've got to consider this case in context of the time. We now have a DNA national database. If we have DNA and it matches somebody on a database, then we can solve a case. If we have DNA so we can link the crimes together, so we know there's one perpetrator involved, but we have no match because there's no database that currently exists, then it doesn't matter how much DNA you collect, you still haven't got a suspect to match that DNA to.
This wasn't one haystack. This was a field of haystacks that we had this needle in.
Looking back on the past cases, Senior Investigating Officer Simon Morgan could find no evidence of further attacks after 1999.
Massively frustrating, because for all the profilers and all the expert advice that would say that he would keep offending, he would not offend, there was never any explanation as to how he would control himself and these urges that he clearly has.
In October 2002, 3 years after his last known offence was committed, the rapist struck once again. This time, Simon was in charge.
We were called to this location, the Shirley area of Croydon. It's a favoured area for the Minstead offender. He attacked an elderly lady in her premises. She lived alone, and she told me something very strange had happened, that he had kissed her goodbye. That's unusual behaviour, and in response to that, we immediately took DNA swabs on both of her cheeks.
The swabs were taken from there and were found to contain a mixture of DNA of the victim, which you would expect because it's taken from her, and the Minstead offender.
From the lino in the kitchen, we recovered a shoe print that was clearly his, not the victim's. Analysis of that revealed it was a Nike Air Terra Contigo trainer, size 10. Tool marks at this venue would also confirm and link him to 5 other venues.
After this attack, the police were no closer to catching the offender. The media became aware that there was a serial rapist and burglar on the loose. They dubbed him the Night Stalker.
By the early 2000s, the community was aware that the Night Stalker attacks were linked and that he was operating across South London.
We know why he picked this area. There were elderly victims for him to prey on. He knew that there's a spectrum of residents here. He knew his hunting ground and he came here to hunt them out.
At the end of the day, you go home, but you realise that there is always the potential that the phone is going to ring and yet another victim is going to report to us that they've gone through the trauma of being attacked by this individual.
Determined to catch the perpetrator in the act, Simon put his team on 24-hour surveillance in the Night Stalker's favourite offending area of Shirley in Croydon.
In 2002, when we confirmed through DNA analysis that he had offended again, we started an immediate proactive operation. This continued through into 2003. I managed to get in excess of over 100 staff from various parts of the organisation, and I developed a proactive strategy that covered a ring of officers around the key offending area. We managed to continue for 6 weeks. It cost over £330,000. It was very expensive, very intense operation, but unfortunately he didn't offend within that catch zone. He moved his offending pattern to Sydenham. He'd never offended in Sydenham before.
You could put a police officer on every street corner, but as soon as he or she turns their back, someone may offend behind their back. And he committed an offence in an area that wasn't covered. So he's missed again.
If he had been in the Shirley area, I'm very confident that that would have been the end of the investigation. He would have been captured. That's a massively frustrating part of the investigation. He'd moved on to a completely new area. He was lucky. It was a lucky move on his behalf. It enabled him to carry on offending because of the size of the proactive investigation. It couldn't be sustained indefinitely. There was always the possibility that he would get away with this and we would never identify him. And that, for me, would have been the most frustrating outcome ever.
Over a decade into Operation Minstead, the elusive serial rapist and burglar known as the Night Stalker remained on the loose.
You are continuously second-guessing the next move and trying to reassure a very vulnerable population that are scared anyway.
Some nights we would have one offence, then nothing for months or years. Some nights we'd have 2 offences. So there was no clear pattern.
Simon and his team had no concrete evidence that could link any known criminal to the offences.
It's the most challenging investigation I've ever led. I think the longevity of it and keeping the momentum going, that was a difficult part, but then it was not so difficult because having met the victims, I knew it was the right thing to do. The end goal was that he had to be caught. It is sad that there were so many victims.
It was the type of case that took years before media interest really ramped up to a level that you would normally associate with someone of that notoriety.
Throughout the investigation, the police carried out extensive media appeals and offered rewards for information on the Night Stalker.
The reward was in place for many years. It went up to £20,000, and it was quite clear that nobody knew who this individual was. Nobody came forward. At no point during all the years that I was there did ever anybody say, it's him and I want this reward. This individual is not clearly going down to the pub, meeting up with his friends, saying, guess what I did last night? So he told absolutely nobody about his offending life.
Whenever the case hit the media, it seemed the offender would go to ground and there would be no new attacks.
When he stopped offending, that was it. The resources were taken away, the inquiry team was stripped right back down to a bare minimum, and we were given other investigations. There was other murders that were coming in that had to be investigated, but all of the time Operation Minstead stayed open. It was there, it was the day job. It was the itch that you could not scratch. It was always within reach, it was always having to be worked on and slowly progressed.
By the early 2000s, groundbreaking advances in forensic science offered investigators a new way to help identify who the Night Stalker was.
The victims identified a black male. However, it must be remembered at that time these offences were occurring late at night. They're elderly people, their eyesight may need to be perfect, so that had to be sort of treated with a little bit of caution. What we did try and do is try and firm that up from the forensic science.
So in 2002 and 2003, DNA advancement had shown that this was a man's profile from the Caribbean, the Windward Islands.
You had to be careful about this result because it was the first time it had been used in any real forensic sort of case. So we tested that. We tested it first of all by taking volunteers from New Scotland Yard staff, obtaining their ancestry, and that almost validated the technique. An investigation team then, I believe, went to the Caribbean and obtained a number of samples from the individual islands.
We went to the Caribbean in order to narrow down which particular island he was from.
We were broadly aware of the challenges that the Met were facing in trying to bring this suspect to justice. One pretty high-profile example where a team of detectives over to the Caribbean to make inquiries. They were subsequently photographed around a pool in a hotel on a day off with the headline, "The Frying Squad." It was bad publicity. I think it was a difficult moment for the police.
We received a lot of assistance from the media. We received a lot of criticism from the media. That is part and parcel of long investigations and of being an SIO. It was frustrating, but it did not detract us from the main focus, and that was finding this individual. Once the analysis proved that the individual had ancestral origins in Jamaica, we were enabled to focus down the investigation from 40,000 plus suspects down to 6,000 that we knew had ancestral origins in Jamaica. That's a massive leap forward in the investigation.
2002, 3, 4 and beyond, Simon approached me as his supervising officer and talked about making a big appeal to South London, South East London, to black men to volunteer their DNA. And we came up with the notion of, apart from media appeals, writing to individuals, asking them to volunteer just to give their DNA, just for this specific comparison.
From day to day was a bit like Groundhog Day. It was a constant motivational battle to keep the staff going, to go and approach these individuals that, for whatever reason, had been identified by the inquiry team as potentially the suspect. And these individuals needed to be approached, and ultimately, yes, we had his DNA, and the DNA was the strongest of the elimination criteria. That was a method that we had to pursue. If he's not offending and we haven't got the resources to have proactive operations, then you cannot sit and do nothing. You have to progress the investigation, and that's what we were doing. We received criticism from the Voice newspaper in Brixton, and they published a front page article with DNA in bold letters, and that stood for "Do not agree to provide a sample."
It was a controversial decision at the time. I think it caused a reaction that perhaps the Met hadn't wholly anticipated. There were a number of individuals who didn't want to provide their DNA.
To address this issue, I went and met with the editor at the Voice newspaper. I explained our investigation, and they kindly gave us space within their newspaper to explain to the communities what we were doing and why we were approaching people within the community. And that helped progress the investigation.
Hundreds came forward and gave their DNA. A number didn't.
Ultimately, we didn't identify the individual through the DNA process. We did manage to reduce the number of suspects within the inquiry, but again, it was frustration of not identifying him through that process. I had other duties, murder investigations, but I led the Minstead investigation, and that was a daily activity, large part of my day, but also on my days off. His offending was always at night. Invariably, Saturday night was his favourite night. It impacted on my career very much, my personal life very much.
By 2009, Simon decided the only way to find the Night Stalker was to catch him in the act. He requested permission to restart surveillance operations in South London.
In 2009, the Metropolitan Police came in for severe criticism in 2 investigations involving serial rapists. The organisation realised that Operation Minstead was going to be in a similar category. It needed to be resolved, he needed to be stopped. It had been going on for 17 years. They gave us all the resources that we had been asking for, and a proactive operation was commenced. The nerve there is to keep that going until he is captured.
We went back to traditional policing, putting police officers on the street, plain clothes, unmarked vehicles. We really wanted every opportunity to get us ahead.
People were understandably asking questions. Why had this Night Stalker, why had Minstead man not been found? And yet there's no necessarily visible sign that much more is being done. In fact, it almost certainly was. It was just that the community might not have been able to see the surveillance officers in their cars working through the night. It was a huge operation.
Surveillance operations are very difficult. It takes a specific type of officer, highly trained, and clearly have to be very observant. The officers were deployed from 10 p.m. till 6 a.m, and these were his favoured offending times. It would only take seconds for an officer to switch off and he could run past and we would have missed him. It would have all have been for nothing.
By November 2009, 17 years after he had committed his first offence, the Night Stalker had been linked to 203 offences, including 5 rapes on elderly people in southeast London.
There were many occasions throughout the life of the investigation where we conducted proactive operations, and time again, the proactive operation didn't work. This was a very challenging investigation, very frustrating, but each time, what do? Pick yourself up and you get on with it again, because you have to maintain that level of enthusiasm and motivation to find the individual.
In the next attempt to catch the perpetrator, Simon deployed a large team of surveillance officers in the Night Stalker's favourite offending area of Shirley in Croydon.
The pressure was immense. The organisation had reached deep into their pockets. This was costing an absolute fortune, and it was realised that we had to maintain this level of proactive work because it was believed within the investigation that this was going to be the way that we would capture him. We had an offence that was linked to the investigation, and CCTV trawling of the area gave us a very poor image of the side of a vehicle going past a school. The experts analysed the CCTV footage and said that that is a Vauxhall Severa. Surveillance teams were all aware that that was believed to be his vehicle.
Armed with this new information, on day 17 of the surveillance operation, 100 officers were on the streets.
In the early hours, I saw a man run from one road up there towards this road and run towards a Severa.
The officers followed that vehicle for about 2 to 3 miles to the Beckenham area where the vehicle was stopped and he was arrested. I got a phone call at, I think it was about 3 o'clock in the morning to say, this is what's happened, the circumstances, and it was quite a surreal moment because I'd waited over 8 years for that particular phone call. I'd ordered the DNA to be taken from him immediately, being run to the laboratory on a car with a blue light, because we needed that turned around very rapidly.
I contacted the lab. We had already had people working 24 hours a day, so that sample was dealt with urgently. By early hours of the following morning, around 7:30, 8 o'clock, a result was obtained.
The phone call I received was from Ray Feisch to say it's a 100% match, he is your man. It was a feeling of great joy, but somewhat numb, to be perfectly honest. It was a day that, at certain times in the investigation over a 10-year period, I thought we would never see that day, I'd never get that phone call. But this was the day that we had all been waiting for.
The person arrested in 2009, not very far from his very first offence, was Delroy Grant.
His car contained items of clothing. DNA from Delroy Grant was found on that clothing. There was also a crowbar. DNA from the crowbar was linked to Delroy Grant. The crowbar was also linked to various burglaries that he had committed.
He lived in Brockley. He was of Jamaican origin, as the DNA analysis revealed. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He would be knocking on people's doors. He would be able to identify potential victims in that way. I wanted to finally meet this individual that I'd waited so long to see. I went into the cell and I actually shook his hand, not applauding what he'd done. It was a sign that it's now over. And he started laughing. He knew my name and he asked if I knew what this was all about. And I assured him that he would know what this is all about. He unfortunately did not respond to any of the questions in the interview. He went off to have his fingerprints taken and he said, "You shouldn't bother, I always wore gloves." I celebrated personally by charging him. It's something that I'd waited many years to do, and at 2:30 the following morning, I took him out of his cell, took him to the charge room, and I personally charged him. And that's what I had waited for. I'd waited for his signature on that charge sheet, and that's what I got. And that, for me, was the reward of many years of effort.
In March 2011, the Night Stalker, 52-year-old Delroy Grant, stood trial.
Delroy Grant is charged with 5 rapes, 6 indecent assaults and 11 burglaries over a 17-year period.
He showed absolutely no remorse. His defence at trial was laughable and a nonsense and quite sad, really.
DNA from semen and saliva links him, the prosecution said, to 12 of the 18 break-ins and attacks, with a 1 in a billion chance of anyone else having the same profile.
The jury came back in 8.5 hours, which is very quick for a jury.
The foreman stood up and the 29 guilty verdicts were read out. And I have to say, personally, when it came to the victim who nearly died on the operating table as a result of his brutal rape in 1999, I did look him in the eye at that point, and it was quite a surreal moment that she finally got her justice, albeit she was long deceased.
Delroy Grant was sentenced to 27 years and 6 months in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until he served 25 years and 8 months of his sentence.
Operation Minstead was by far the biggest serial rape investigation to date that the Metropolitan Police has ever conducted. Personally, I think he is responsible for a terror campaign. He frightened elderly residents in communities across South London. He caused immense pain and suffering to victims and to their families. Nobody expects this type of behaviour. It's unheard of.
After the Night Stalker was finally arrested and convicted, the police issued a pretty grovelling apology describing wrongly eliminating Delroy Grant back in 1999 as a basic policing error.
We are deeply sorry for the harm suffered by all those other victims and for our failure to bring Grant to justice earlier.
The 1999 missed opportunity. Officers managed to trace Delroy Grant as the owner of a vehicle that was seen near to a crime scene. The truth is that they knocked on his door 7 days after the brutal attack in Orpington in August of 1999.
They said, "Is Delroy Grant in?" She answered them, "He's not." She then went on and started describing Delroy Grant Jr. If that woman who answered the door had answered in a way of Delroy Grant Sr., it may have been a completely different picture from that day on.
Nobody spotted the human error that took place in 1999. And unfortunately, that individual was buried under tens of thousands of more suspects that were being looked at, and that individual was lost in the inquiry.
They called Delroy Grant. He could have been caught earlier for a number of reasons. I'm proud of the fact that the professionalism of Simon and his team brought him to charge. I'm not proud of the fact that vulnerable elderly people suffered at his hands, though. That other human beings can treat vulnerable human beings in that way. I take no pride in that.
The investigation took 10 years of my career. It was a huge part of my professional service. Does it become personal? It has to. That's human nature. It was a constant thought, a constant blight, and a constant pressure. It needed to be solved. And it was the right thing for me to invest my career into. It was 100% worth it. A case I will never forget.